Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this Here Comes Solar Chat. I'm Chris Neidl. Today we're going to be discussing the experiences of 3 different group-based solar initiatives that took place or are currently taking place in New York City or the greater New York City Metro area. I'm really excited and very lucky to have 3 excellent guests who can talk with us about this, each of whom were actually centrally involved in these initiatives in different ways. So just quickly introduce them. We have first Ellen Honigstock, who by day is actually the Director of Education Development at the Urban Green Council, but she's also was the founder of the volunteer-led neighborhood-based organization Sustainable Kensington Windsor Terrace, and it was in this capacity that she was really the catalyst and one of the key organizers of Solarize Brooklyn, an initiative that took place in the borough of Brooklyn in 2013 and 2014. And that's what she'll be sharing some experiences with today. We've got Mirele Goldsmith, who actually is the former head of the Jewish Greening Fellowship, which is a program of the national nonprofit Hazon. Under Mirele's leadership, JGF pioneered a very novel and effective group-based purchasing initiative in the downstate area across a few different counties here in downstate New York. So we're going to focus on that today. And then Jeff Irvine is the lead New York City solar ombudsman at Sustainable CUNY, and as someone who works with him regularly, he does a lot of things in that capacity, but today he's going to talk about a new initiative actually that really is just getting underway that CUNY is leading called Solarize Community Board 6, which is in a cluster of neighborhoods in western Brooklyn that make up Community Board 6. So we'll go ahead and start, but just to give a little bit of context in terms of what I'd like to talk about, you know, what we really would like to, we've got 3 practitioners here that have either been through or have put a lot of thought into putting these group-based types of initiatives together. So I really want to be able to kind of talk about those experiences so that other practitioners in the city, state, or beyond might be able to get some insight into these processes. There's 2 themes, though, that I hope we can cover through that conversation that I think are interesting, that sort of are commonalities that all of your programs share. One is they're all examples of non-commercial actors intervening in the solar market to try to make that market work better. So whether a volunteer organization or a nonprofit or a publicly supported institution. So I'd kind of like to talk a little bit about what's the need for that, what types of forms that it takes, and why is it important. And then the other thing more specifically, which is really the subject here, is the central activity of your programs had to do with grouping together prospective solar adopters. And so I'd like to kind of, you know, this is a sort of a type of thing that's occurred over many years actually in solar on the grassroots level, but I'd sort of like to talk about it in terms of why are groups important, what kind of value is really generated for both the potential adopter or for solar contractors. So we'd like to kind of get into that specifically in the context of New York. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. I think the best way to proceed is just to really begin with each of you giving maybe a high-level sketch of your program, sort of what the model deployed was, who was involved, and what some of the real kind of key outcomes were. So, Mirele, is it okay if we start with you?
Sure.
All right.
So the Jewish Greening Fellowship is a network of 55 community-based nonprofits in the New York area, and they vary from synagogues to Jewish community centers to social service agencies and even private schools. And all of these organizations have made a commitment to mobilize their communities in response to climate change. And they take on various activities, everything from education with young people to making their own operations more sustainable and reducing energy. And one of the requirements we've had in the program is that they all undergo an energy audit. And during the first, I guess, 4 years of the program, 6 of them did install solar energy systems, and we found that doing that is really a rallying point for the community. It's something people are very proud of in these mission-driven organizations, that they're really taking this very visible step to, you know, producing renewable energy. And we realized that a lot more of the organizations would probably like to do this, but they were overwhelmed by the process. And that's why, working with Solar One, we decided to launch a group purchasing program. Basically, going on from there, it's pretty straightforward. We solicited all the organizations to find out which ones were interested in the project. We narrowed it down. We did some pre-screening to see if they were appropriate. for solar installation. And then we put together a working group that oversaw a process of putting out an RFP and soliciting bids from installers. We selected an installer, got a great price. We decided to go with a PPA model, since these are nonprofit organizations that can't take tax credits, can't use them themselves. We selected the installer, and now we're still in the process of guiding the organizations through the installation process. And at some point, we hope to do a lot of publicity and to really share this model more broadly, both in New York and because we're really a model for the Jewish community across the country, to sort of inspire others to take on this type of a project.
Great, thanks. And we'll get into the details of obviously a lot that you mentioned there. One term to define, PPA financing, which is really important, particularly for nonprofits, or power purchasing agreements, and that's a model, again, we'll get into the details at the end of the conversation, but where a third party essentially owns the system, and then where the system is installed, that site basically purchases that solar power over a period of time. So we'll get into that. So Ellen, can we move on to you? Can you tell us a bit about Solarize Brooklyn?
Sure. So Sustainable Kensington Windsor Terrace is a very loosely organized group of volunteers in central Brooklyn. Before Solarize, we had done a couple of energy competitions. One was with 29 families, really centered around our community garden, and you know, and we reduced our consumption by 6% over about 3 months across the 29 families, which was pretty amazing. So we brought it to our council member, and he expanded it to our to the district, to about 150 families, and it was fun, and it was really just about increasing awareness about energy consumption. So the next thing we wanted to do was try to figure out how to get more awareness across the board about sustainability. So right around New Year's of 2013, I was going to put solar on my house, and I thought, you know, if I'm going to do all this research, I might as well just, you know, make that information open to the neighborhood. So in doing so, I found about 35 people that were interested in doing it, just from a posting to our neighborhood listserv. And from there, we were like, hey, let's just make this a project. Let's, you know, get Solar One involved. And it was a very sort of natural process. We didn't start out, it sounds like, you know, Mirele, you guys were very organized from the get-go. Ours was like, hey, let's see what we can do. And but we, you know, after we hooked up with Solar One, we saw what other Solarize projects did. We figured out that there was a process for this. And at the end of the day, we reached over 600 or 700 people at educational events. We had an RFP process and vetted the solar contractors, and we did it in a very organized, very, very transparent process within the neighborhood. And at the end of the day, we ended up with 23 solar installations, 18 PV systems, and 5 solar thermal systems. It's not a huge amount of solar, but we more than doubled the amount of solar that was in our neighborhoods previous to that. So we were really excited. But the thing we really were trying to do was normalize the idea of solar and sustainability in general in our neighborhood, and that we definitely did, because people now know the language of how to talk about these things. So the project is mostly complete, with a few projects that are still having a little bit of difficulty at the end, but it was largely successful in terms of the awareness and the normalizing bit that we were going for. So,
yeah, and just we did some follow-up research looking at data of installs in Brooklyn, and we calculated roughly that one initiative probably added about close to 10% more capacity of residential solar throughout the borough. So that's not a small number when you think about it. Very concentrated.
Awesome. I did not know that.
So Jeff, obviously you're at an early stage here, and you've sort of had the benefit of looking at a variety of different Solarize sort of initiatives and sort of tweaking it for context and lessons learned over time. Can you tell us a little bit about where you are with the program and sort of what the focuses and goals are?
Sure. So the background on our program is it's really building off of the work that Sustainable CUNY has done in New York City, really going all the way back to 2006. So Sustainable CUNY has had a number of these federal grants to support solar power in the city. Sustainable CUNY helped to have New York City named one of the original Solar America cities as part of the DOE program there, and now we're working on the Rooftop Solar Challenge 2, which is part of the Sunshot initiative. And so our Community Board 6 Solarize program grew out of that grant and one of our working groups in the city. We have 2 working groups focused on 2 different areas of balance of system costs. So that's really the focus of the grant, is reducing balance of system costs or non-hardware costs of solar in New York City and across New York State. That initiative is called the NY Solar Smart Initiative. But our Solarize effort really grew out of one of the working groups within that grant, our Financing Options Working Group for New York City, which is composed of the Mayor's Office of Sustainability, New York City Economic Development Corporation, with members including Solar One, NYSERDA, Grid Alternatives, and others, really working together on building out financing options and models for New York City that will work in a targeted way. Our other working group in the city is a permitting and interconnection working group where we have Con Edison, DOB, the fire department, and other key stakeholders who are all working with us to help reduce balance of system costs and streamline solar permitting and the whole process in the city. And so the goal of our Solarize program is to build off the success of Solarize Brooklyn and really integrate that full framework that we've developed through these working groups over the years, so bringing in Department of Buildings and working with all these different stakeholders to help streamline the process in a holistic way. And so we found CB6 to be a great partner. We're working with the community board there. We targeted CB6 for a number of different reasons, including there was one of the original solar empowerment zones in the city, so those are areas where solar has the most benefit to the grid, as identified by Con Edison. We also did a lot of outreach to community-based organizations in those neighborhoods, which include Carroll Gardens, Park Slope, down into Red Hook, up into Cobble Hill, and found a lot of support there. Finally, as Solarize Brooklyn certainly knows well, the challenges of Brooklyn are unique, and the building stock there poses unique challenges to solar, and so one of the goals of our program is to really look at ways of overcoming those challenges and bringing a lot of stakeholders to the table to address them. So in terms of where we are at this point, we released an RFP at the end of last year, 2014, and are now in the process of selecting an installer for the program.
Great, thanks. Yeah, a lot there that we'll talk about, particularly the unique contextual factors in New York City or Brooklyn specifically that are both good and bad for solar. But one thing that always sort of fascinates me with my program, Here Comes Solar, I looked so much at the 2 programs of Solarize Brooklyn and Jewish Greening Fellowship to kind of arrive at the model that we're using now with Here Comes Solar. And it's just sort of interesting to me the history of how influence sort of happens and where people kind of get the ideas for particular models, the influences that they draw from. So I just wanted to kind of throw that out first for all 3 of you. Maybe Ellen, you could start. You had mentioned that it sort of organically took shape in your neighborhood, but were there other reference points, either in the state or nationally, that you looked at that gave you kind of a blueprint to sort of follow in terms of putting together a Solarize campaign?
Oh, definitely. I mean, we were really. I mean, the folks that made up the core group. We had I'm an architect. We had people who were involved with public policy. It's not like we didn't know anything about what we were doing. We actually thought we knew way more than we did know, and didn't actually realize how useful Solar One was going to be to us in terms of capacity and other knowledge. And I will, every chance I get, give you guys a shout out for that. But we used the other Solarize model, Solarize Portland in particular. It was well organized, and the NREL National Renewable Energy Laboratory document that had best practices and like do's and don'ts was a really amazing document, and we took all of their advice because their advice was true and and useful. But in terms of reaching people, I mean, as you say, Brooklyn is a very specific place. I mean, the neighborhoods we chose, Kensington and Windsor Terrace, they're very tight. They have a lot of local listservs, a lot of community groups so people can talk to each other. And we added Flatbush as well because it's a different kind of neighborhood with bigger buildings that we were interested for solar thermal. But also there's a lot of there's an environmental infrastructure and a lot of interest. Because the one thing we realize is like people trying to sell solar to individuals is never going to work as well as a neighbor saying, oh, I did it. Here, come to my house. Oh, here, I'll show you how I did it. Or, you know, Joe down the street did it. He loves it. Like, that is just worth like 10,000 sales calls, we thought. And we think that's true because the enthusiasm we saw among the neighborhood education sessions was amazing. And you got, you know, neighbors talking to neighbors, and it just got over that barrier of like, wait, it's so complex. I can't figure this out. I don't want to do it. And someone will say, look, he figured it out. That guy's an expert. He'll show you how to do it. Relax. It can happen, and it's not rocket science. And I think that was the piece of it that was so attractive for us.
Okay, great. Yeah, I mean, I think what you described there as the peer-to-peer force there in terms of someone more likely adopting a technology, particularly in an early stage because a neighbor. There's been a lot of quantification of that, and that definitely is the case with solar. It tends to grow that way. Mirele, can you give us a little bit of background in terms of what the sort of, again, maybe the origins or the ideas that you look to when you put together this this model? I know you obviously worked with my predecessor, Max Joel, quite closely on developing that model, but were there other programs that you were able to look to?
Well, thank you for mentioning Max. I wanted to give him a shout out too. And as Ellen said, if it hadn't been for Solar One, there is no way we would have done this. We wouldn't have had the chutzpah to take it on, first of all, and we never could have done it because we definitely did not have the expertise. And I know that Max did a lot of research about other programs, and he came back to us with, you know, some of those lessons learned. And one thing I remember very clearly him telling me 3.5 years ago was that having a network, a relationship of trust with the organizations would be really key, and that's why part of the reason he wanted to work with us. And I think that was dead on. I don't know how we could have done it if we didn't have a pre-existing relationship. It's sort of like what Ellen was describing with the neighbors. All of our organizations are part of a network of Jewish organizations in the New York area, and the funder of the Jewish Greening Fellowship is the UJA Federation of New York, which is really probably the most credible, most trusted organization. It's the umbrella charity of the Jewish community. So the fact that we were a part of that network just gave us a lot of credibility. One thing I will mention, I remember reading on a booklet that was put together by the Interfaith Power and Light of Greater Washington. I'm sorry I didn't look up the name of the booklet right now, but you can find it if you go to their website, and it describes a number of solar installations that were done at houses of worship in the Washington area, and I found that extremely helpful. First of all, because it spoke to the dynamics of the kind of organizations that we work with, but also just because it laid out all of the things, all of the obstacles that you can encounter along the way, and how the organizations had to change direction and had to be flexible, and it really gave me a sense of what we could expect getting into it, and I found that extremely helpful.
Great. And now, Jeff, that you're obviously, a lot of this is sort of tip of the iceberg stuff, where publicly it may not be announced yet that your program is moving forward, but you guys have done a lot of the work already on what the model is going to be and who your partners are going to be. And in the process of doing that, who were you, what did you look to? How did you sort of absorb the lessons learned from other programs, both locally and not so locally?
We tried to cast a wide net. I think more information is always better, and there's been so much great work that has been done on community solar and aggregation and Solarize efforts across the country that we tried to speak to really as many people as we can. So certainly we had a lot of conversations with Max. He's on one of our working groups, as well as you, Chris, and we've spoken with Connecticut and Massachusetts. We've looked a lot at, you mentioned that there's been research to quantify those peer-to-peer effects. So we've looked a lot at the work of Ken Gillingham at Yale, quantifying the effects. I think the statistic is that something like, I think looking at Solarize Connecticut, it was a 33% increase in installations per block group during a Solarize campaign. So you really can see that peer-to-peer effect. So we tried to talk to a lot of different people who had both worked on Solarize efforts on the ground as well as at the top level organizational level, and taking bits and pieces of each of those campaigns and kind of bringing them together in a way that we think will work well for our target area.
Great. Yeah, I think that one thing, I might stick with you and Jeff to answer this first. One thing that's really interesting to me, and a lot of the people who are watching this will know, in just recent years, solar has transformed into a multi-billion-dollar industry. It has arrived. It's a commercially sophisticated global industry. So some people might ask, what is then, given that and what you might follow in the headlines of the Wall Street Journal, why is there a need still for this sort of intervention by non-commercial actors, whether they're nonprofits or whatever, to help make solar sort of happen in particular markets? So what is the significance, would you say, really, of groups like Ellen's and Mirele's and your own, and sort of making it happen here in New York?
Sure, I think that's a really good question, and certainly the solar market has grown exponentially. Obviously not entirely on its own through the policy work of countless individuals, but the reason why community efforts such as the Solarize efforts that we're talking about today are so important, I think, is moving that market forward at a faster pace, and also doing it in targeted ways in areas that maybe the market hasn't quite caught up to some of the areas where it's been growing more quickly in other parts of the country. So, Brooklyn is a perfect example. There are unique challenges to installing solar in Brooklyn and also in the 5 boroughs. It's a more complicated regulatory environment. The building stock is older and more challenging. And as a result, it's more expensive to install solar here than it is in Westchester, for example. And so one thing that these community-led efforts can do is to bring the power of neighbors together. Everybody knows that Solarize aims to bring down cost through aggregation, but it's much more than that. It's kind of holding people by the hand and showing them that this is a much easier process than they think it might be. And also working with the solar installers, the business side, the industry side, to help them through that process and finding ways that maybe the market can use going forward but hasn't quite figured out on its own yet because there's low-hanging fruit elsewhere. So I think it really comes down to moving the market forward more quickly in targeted areas where maybe eventually the market would catch up, but it's going to take a lot of time. And there is urgency in installing renewable energy. And so the more we can move the market forward through these types of efforts, I think it will be beneficial for everyone. And the last point I would make is that the reason why it's important for these nonprofits and third-party entities is because they're a trusted source. Certainly, customers are used to being sold products, but when it's a complex process and maybe something that they're not familiar with, the experience of many Solarize programs has been that the number one benefit is the fact that they can talk to the third party who's organizing the campaign and get that unbiased information to make them feel confident in the choice that they're making and the investment in their home. So I think those components all show why these types of Solarize and community-based efforts are so important, especially right now.
Right. So, Ellen, a lot of that probably resonates with your own experience, obviously. I wonder, as someone who's on the other end of this, if you want to speak at all to some of those Brooklyn-specific characteristics and how well a conventional Solarize model sort of lines up with it. I'll just throw a couple things out there that I think might be a little bit different. One is that in Brooklyn it seems that there's not a lot of competition already among installers. They're not exactly banging down the doors of brownstones to get their business, because there's a lot of inputs and uncertainties that have to go in on their end for a relatively low output in terms of revenue. So is there a problem with solarization that you're essentially offering them the prospect of more of something that they don't already want? So how do you sort of make it, I guess, sort of sweeten the pot? Or I mean, obviously you're able to get a lot of installers to put in bids for the project, but did you also get a lot of resistance, I guess, from some of the installers that were just not really interested in working in Brooklyn, and there was something you had to do to kind of overcome that?
Yes, that was a big fat yes. The thing with the when we sent out the RFPs, we overcomplicated it a little bit by asking for solar thermal and solar PV, and we got a sort of mishmash of bids. So to sort of separate the information and take the solar thermal out of it, because that ended up actually being a lot simpler, and focus on the PV side, there was like two sort of buckets. One was sort of the mom and pop shop that was like, yeah, sure, we can totally do this. Send me some clients and we'll do this. We're like, but you might get 300 clients. Can you handle this? And they just couldn't even answer the question, right? And then the other bucket was the more commercial, sophisticated installers who were aware of the complexities and could handle the volume but we're also still a little bit like couldn't understand the complexity of the New York City landscape with, in terms of all the filing stuff they had to do. And so I think regardless if we looked at all of the submittals that we got for the RFP, they all would have been overwhelmed for different reasons, right? So, that said, I think your Here Comes Solar solution with just a smaller group is actually really smart for that reason, because both the volume and the regulatory atmosphere made it, orders of magnitude more difficult. Mm-hmm. But everyone worked through it. We did it. They put extra staff. The installer put extra staff on they worked through the weekends to work through the backlog, and they made a great effort to get through that. But those were real issues. But one thing that I want to add to what Jeff said, in terms of having a nonprofit or a group sort of vet an installer, one barrier that I noticed that I didn't expect was that if you have even a vetted installer and you say, here, 100 people, you should call this guy, they'll come to your house and install solar, they're still not going to do it. But if they sign up with a neighborhood group and then the installer calls them, they're like, oh, hey, great, thanks for calling, and the conversation starts. Like way, way more effective than relying on the homeowner to call the installer. That one little bit made a huge, huge difference on being able to get inside people's heads.
And one other thing I'd like, again, for you to respond to, Ellen, and then maybe Jeff, you could talk about what you guys are doing in terms of segmenting the market. I mean, here in New York, there are, contrary to popular perception, there are a lot of 1 to 4 family homes that are owner-occupied, the sort of iconic row house throughout the borough. But most people, myself included, live in multifamily buildings, even if you're an owner of a condo or a shareholder at a co-op. And those are very different in terms of the challenges that sort of face them and how decisions are made. So I'm wondering, what was your experience sort of placing, you said that at Flatbush, I believe you were sort of focusing on because there was a lot of multifamily, but being able to put this type of building in a program that also had 1 to 4 family homes, in a program that had a sort of a window of time in which people had to act. So if you could just give us a little bit of insight into the co-op experience, it would be great.
Sure. That was, that was another factor. This was our first time out, and these were all of our neighbors, and we were trying to make it as inclusive as possible. Doing it again, we probably would have said, co-op folks, come on Tuesday, single family, 1 to 4 family homeowners, come on Thursday. They have completely different concerns, their buildings are different, and as you say, their decision-making strategy is different. That said, the way we organized our project, we ended up with 9 or 10 educational sessions in libraries and Ys around the neighborhoods. So it just so happened the ones that were closer to bigger buildings were populated by co-op and condo board members and residents, and the ones in lower where there are smaller buildings and more houses, we had more homeowners. So that sort of, luckily for us, naturally happened, where we didn't have a lot of people listening to information that they weren't interested in at the educational sessions. Mm-hmm. That was pure luck. If we did it again, we would do that more intentionally. But as for the co-ops have such an amazing potential for solar because they have these roofs that are generally well maintained. They have a structure to make decisions and all this stuff. So. And the best proposals we saw from the installers were for the co-ops, but a lot of them just couldn't get past their decision-making period because we set an arbitrary date of like whatever it was, July 15th, and they couldn't make that happen. So there's a lot of lessons learned, and I would totally recommend going forward with as many co-op programs as you can because you also get a lot more New Yorkers involved with personally purchasing solar, which I think is a really good thing for people to, people want to do it. They want to participate.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, with co-ops, it's funny. They're roofs that solar installers would love, but the sales process is so hard. Where with some of these smaller flat roof buildings that we see, it's roofs that they don't necessarily love, but there's a very eager customer. So it's because of the differences there. How do you sort of put them into a similar type of program that that has one time frame. So Jeff, I'm wondering, you and I have talked about this before, I know you put a lot of thought into it, but is there a way in which you have started to kind of treat these as 2 different animals that require a different program approach?
Yeah, so we're actually taking a bit of a broader approach in Community Board 6. So we'll be not only including residential customers, but also commercial customers. So including small commercial buildings that fit within the 25 to 200 kW scale, which is used by NYSERDA for the New York Sun incentive. And so, and I completely agree that I think the education component and the outreach component for those different sectors is completely different and needs to be segmented. So that's something that we've been thinking about as we've been planning out how we're going to do the actual implementation of our plan, is reaching these different groups through different networks. So starting at the, going through bids rather than neighborhood associations, and really tapping into different networks, but doing so in an integrated way so that the program as a whole is able to be more successful through installing more solar and really using the two different sectors separately in terms of outreach, but together in terms of creating a fully successful program.
Great. Now, there's so much that we could potentially divert ourselves with in terms of drilling down deeper, but what I'd like to really back up and focus on, the word network has been brought up by all of us several times already in this conversation. I think it is partially an answer to the original question about what is it that these civil society groups bring, to the table, and a lot of it is access, obviously, to various different networks, whether they're informal or they're quasi-formal or formal, and then this becomes the infrastructure, basically, for bringing in potential participants, but it also can bring skills into the working group that can then be utilized. So what I wanted to do is start with Mirele, because I think that your experience with the working group and the network that you're part of is very different from the Solarize. It's not geographically defined. It's essentially an identity group that you have across different parts of the lower part of the state. Can you tell me a little bit about how the existing network of Hazon and the Jewish Greening Fellowship was able to bring in and recruit people, but then also maybe was able to bring in some of the skills that were required to put together a well-functioning working group that ultimately helped with the decision-making process?
Well, I have to say it wasn't that we realized that beforehand, but as we began to get into the project, we saw that there were, we were going to have to make a bunch of decisions, and we needed a group that could make the decisions that would have the trust of everyone, have credibility in making those decisions. So we decided to assemble this working group. It included representatives of the UJA Federation of New York, as I mentioned, who had some expertise in facilities management. It included some staff from organizations that had already installed solar, so had some practical experience. Key in our setting is that all of these organizations are run by boards of directors who are volunteers. So we had to have some people who would represent that perspective as well, and we were able to have a couple of people who had, one who had a lot of facilities experience and had actually installed a solar system previously at their organization, and another one who was a board member of a very prestigious organization. So we knew we would bring some clout with him. A very key decision that we made early on, which was suggested by the working group, was that we should have a lead organization, which is something Max and I had not thought of, but apparently had been used previously in other group buying situations. So Jewish Home Life Care, which is a very large long-term care facility, stepped up to take that role. And I think that gave us just a lot of credibility with the network. And when we ran into some areas where we needed more expertise, they were able to get it for us. One of the issues that came up with us was we knew that all of these organizations would want to carefully review the power purchase agreement, and they all have lawyers on their boards, so they tend to have a lot of questions about legal matters. Mm-hmm. And we were able to have a pro bono lawyer from Jewish Home Life Care review the power purchase agreement and kind of, give it the stamp of approval. We still had to make changes for various organizations that, requested things. Some of them we didn't think were the best way to go, but in order for them to, be willing to sign the agreement, they had to, their boards had to be willing to sign off on it. So we were able to assemble a group that had the credibility and had these different perspectives. In the end, I have to say that the main decision at that point was, selecting the installer after we received the bids, and it was mainly the lead agency, Jewish Home Life Care, along with Max and myself, and who made the decision. Everyone else signed off on it. But that just shows the value of having that organization that had made a strong commitment to be involved in every aspect of the process.
Mm-hmm. And just, do you recall exactly how it is that they came in and filled that role? Obviously you explained very clearly why it's important in terms of credibility and recruitment of certain skills that were required, because it's a complicated thing to do an RFP, and then when it came to the PPA, these are complicated arrangements. So do you remember, though, how it is that they came in? Did you heavily recruit them to do that, or they sort of do that of their own volition?
Well, after the working group said we needed a lead agency, we looked around at all the organizations that were involved, that were interested in doing the solar installations, and this organization is the largest, probably the largest one. Well, maybe not, but they're very large, and they have sophisticated staff there. And the COO of the organization was very committed to doing this, and we knew that he would have, he really would have a lot to offer, in addition to the fact that they had a lot of credibility. So we asked them to do it, and they stepped up right away. So we were very lucky.
Great. Now, you mentioned it when you were describing at the beginning, Ellen, just the program at a high level. The various different libraries and venues that were brought together, and listservs, and individuals playing different roles. Can you kind of sketch that a little bit in terms of what that kind of civic infrastructure was that actually helped drive the success of the program?
Sure. So most of that really is just from being neighbors and living here. So of the 35 people who stepped up originally, like, hey, I'm going to do this. Anyone want to do this with me? The ones that stayed with us through the program, one was actually a solar installer, so he brought a wealth of information. One is involved was with ACRE, with the Accelerator for Clean and Renewable Energy, and had a lot of great feedback on how to approach elected officials, who ended up being great resources for us to get people to come to our events. And the others were just really connected to the community, so they knew the people at the library and the people at the Y, and we were all different religions, so we could connect with our religious listservs, and we had kids in different schools, so we were able to get, to those listservs. So it just multiplies, because once someone sees, hey, come to this thing in your neighborhood, and then you see it on your school listserv, and then you see it on the one from your synagogue, and all of a sudden it's something that's happening in your neighborhood that you want to be part of. And I guess if you're going to be someone that's going to step up and try to convince your neighbors to do something that's out of the ordinary, you're going to be the kind of person that's connected to everyone in your organization, in your neighborhood, right? So we also had the benefit of people had heard from us before about other environmentally related things, so they were able to trust us both personally and all the organizations that we were part of. That was sort of where we started, and then once we got connected to the councilman and the borough president and those folks, they just were able to open doors that we hadn't even thought of, and that that was they were probably responsible for 2/3 of the people that came into the program.
And it is something that was, obviously there was some technical assistance from Solar One, and Max was very involved, did an amazing job on it, but it was this group of people who came together mostly on a voluntary basis to generate this campaign. What were the real kind of essential skills or assets that you sort of had to pool in order to be able to kind of really run this, in order to kind of really get it going? I mean, you mentioned already some of the skill sets, but you had a website, I think. What were some of the tools that you sort of used to really put this thing together?
Well, Solar One brought the website. They did all that. So that was, we wouldn't have had that otherwise. And everything was really, we didn't have any legal representation, which now that I'm thinking about it, we probably should have. But TR had the experience that TR brought from the solar perspective. He was an installer and was able to give us feedback from what it looked like on the other side.
Right.
And what I'm trying not to say here is that we kind of took a leap without having the expertise maybe that we should have. And Solar One really did fill in the technical stuff where when we hit a gap, they were able to fill it in. But all of us had done similar projects in terms of neighborhood campaigns and political actions and things like that. So that wasn't unusual for us, and that didn't scare us, and that didn't put us off. So we were thinking about this, I think, as a political action more than an environmental action, and we could speak the environmental language. So you put those things together. We weren't phased at all until we got to the technical part where we realized, the capacity and the technical expertise we were lacking, which Solar One filled in perfectly.
But you heard from Solar One. You also mentioned TR as a member of your working group. You also had some interesting inside perspective on how co-ops work from, I know, Troy and Ann.
Oh, great. Yes.
What's really interesting about these, which is just sort of a main theme or thing that we really try to be cognizant of in our own program, is that the neighborhood or the community that you're working in isn't simply the passive recipient of the benefit, but they actually have kind of the assets, skills, and abilities to kind of make the thing work. To me, that's really interesting.
Right.
And Jeff, I'm wondering, what you guys are doing is Community Board 6 is both a geographic area, which is where you're focusing, but you're also working with the body, the actual institution, I guess, of the Community Board to do some of the promotion. So can you explain a little bit about how that relationship works and how it is that you're working with them as a partner, maybe other local groups to tackle do some of the outreach, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, I mean, CB6 is a terrific partner, and we really, we wouldn't be able to do this without their help. So what they've done is they have an existing network of other community-based organizations, civic groups, neighborhood associations, bids in the 6 neighborhoods that make up CB6, and they've done outreach to those organizations to gauge interest. And once we launch the program, we'll be working with them sort of kind of top down and getting the word out into the communities through that network that already exists. And so because they're representative of the community and they do this type of initiative, not in the context of solar all the time, but they are working with these groups all the time. They have spaces at local churches, schools, etc., where we can hold events. That's been a huge help to us as we look to organize the program. CUNY and our partners have been more focused on the technical side because they've allowed us to be freed up to do that. And so, it's almost kind of the reverse of what Ellen was describing with the original Solarize Brooklyn.
Mm-hmm. One thing, you have really good insight into this, Jeff, because of the other work that you guys do in terms of trying to streamline processes. It's well known here in New York City. It just takes longer to get really any kind of construction project done, and solar is certainly included in that as well. There's a lot of things that have to happen, a lot of filing with the Department of Buildings, and there's the fire department, and there's content interconnection. And that time can actually really add up quite a bit. So when it comes to a couple of things, when it comes to the upfront, most Solarize campaigns are focused on the customer acquisition. They connect the installer to the customer, and then they're sort of on their own after that. Can we afford to have such a limited sort of scope in New York, given how long that process is after a contract is signed, given how still somewhat uncertain it is in terms of how long it's going to take or what it's going to cost is going to be, particularly when you have a lot of installers that may be participating that haven't done a lot of work in this area because they've been avoiding it? So is there something you've built into your program that's sort of post-contract oriented, I guess, that sort of gives people ongoing support up until the time they actually get a solar system on their roof?
Yeah, so I think that's exactly right, that you can't just cut the program off once the customer has been handed off to the installer, that it needs to be a joint process throughout the whole program until the installations are done, and it needs to be a process of working together. So we at CUNY have a long history of working with Department of Buildings, working with FDNY, Con Edison, and we're looking to leverage those relationships. We have an ongoing working group with them that has been working on streamlining processes in the city. And certainly, New York is never going to be the fastest jurisdiction in the country in terms of processing solar, and for good reason. The building stock is more complicated here, and there are various rules that need to be abided by. But we think that by working with all of these stakeholders and really bringing them together and making sure that they know when there's going to be an influx of Solarize applications coming down the queue, they can prepare for it in advance, that it's going to help to streamline that process, not just for the program, but also to kind of create a model and create the expectations for what's going to happen as the market grows and this kind of thing is happening more naturally. So it really can be a win-win for everyone by gaining this experience and working together with all of the relevant stakeholders and agencies, so that they find the best way to handle when there's a huge influx of solar applications coming from a specific neighborhood.
Right. Okay. And we're almost out of time. Time flies when you get into the details of this stuff. But one thing I definitely would love to be able to before ending maybe with some final thoughts, is the really critically important subject of finance. Obviously, we know in the markets that are more evolved in the United States, like California, for instance, most new residential solar installations have been driven because of access to forms of financing like leasing and increasingly loans. So I'm wondering if, to what extent, I know with Solarize Brooklyn, Ellen, it was kind of right before a lot of these things were really arriving in New York. There just really weren't a lot of options. So I'd love your perspective on how you thought the sort of lack of like a real strong financial component may have influenced the outcomes of the program. Jeff, I'm wondering if you have built financing more sort of centrally into the program at all, in terms of what you're educating people around. And then Mirele, which is, it's a totally different model, but the financing was such a key part of making it work for the types of agencies that you were representing, actually. You know, these are nonprofits. So why don't we go sort of backwards, actually, and start with Mirele, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about why it was, one, that PPA financing was really significant for your group, and how it is that working as a group actually made PPA financing more viable from a solicitation point of view.
Great question. I think I would start by saying that PPA financing is not the best option for nonprofit organizations. And I actually was speaking at a conference that we had last week, and I was, very proudly telling a board member from a local congregation about our group purchasing project, and he said, "I would never do that for our synagogue. It's not a good way to do it." And in fact, we have one organization that had already installed one solar system, and under our program they're adding solar panels. And at first they said, "No, we definitely don't want to do it. It was so much better when we were able to acquire the system on our own," Yeah. But then they realized that they can't do that anymore, so they decided to participate in our program. We had a number of organizations in the Jewish Greening Fellowship. I think 6 had previously installed solar energy systems, and they had all received grants and put together the funding so that they own those systems and they get all the benefit of them. When we got into this project, we had a discussion in the working group about what we should do, and there were a lot of creative ideas about setting up our own financing arm. To be honest with you, I can't go into the details because I don't really understand them, but people who were there had a lot of ideas how we could, get a philanthropic partner perhaps to put up the funding, and finance it ourselves. And in the end, we decided that that would add such a layer of complication, and of course, then we would have to convince everybody who was signing on that made sense, and they would be getting into something a lot more complicated as well. And we decided that at this time, it would be better to go with the simplest possible model, which was to use power purchase agreements. And it was an issue also when we received the bids, because it was clear from the bids of the various installers that some were not sure they could finance all the projects. And we wanted to choose an installer who would agree to do all the projects. Now, looking back on it, we lost a lot of projects along the way, which turned out not to be appropriate despite the screening that we had done. So maybe we would have made a different choice if we had really understood that, but we wanted to choose an installer who could finance the entire project and was willing to do all of the projects if they turned out to be viable. So that was a big factor in selecting the installer. So the financing is really key, and I'm really glad to hear that CUNY is working on some of these issues, these policy issues, because I think there are a lot of organizations out there who would like to do this if it was more, if it was more attractive and easier to do.
Yeah, and just to also clarify, so the reason why it's important, if I didn't mention at the beginning, is because nonprofits, obviously, as non-tax-paying entities, can't, monetize or utilize the tax credits, the federal tax credits, and sometimes in some cases state tax credits, which are so key to making solar affordable. So if you're a nonprofit that has the financial resources without the credits, then maybe ownership can be a viable type of model. But for many nonprofits in the faith community or otherwise, where it's not, having a third-party owned, where a tax equity investor basically is able to come in, becomes critical, really, really important. But you brought up a really interesting thing there, Mirele, too, about PPAs are long-term paybacks for the investors, and they often like to focus on larger projects. So it was kind of interesting as a group that you were able to say, as a condition of a bid, you also need to do some of these other projects, give them PPAs that may have been otherwise kind of marginal and not eligible for BPAs on their own. So I think that's kind of an interesting sort of value of the group, actually. But let's sort of shift to the Solarize experience. And Ellen, as we said, I know there was a financing component, but this was kind of really just before there was sort of a wave of financing options to become prevalent in New York. Tell us a little bit about the feedback you got from participants about how important financing would have been, or maybe was it not that important? I'm not sure.
No, it was very, very important. And in the RFP process, we asked for financing options, but they were terrible. And they were, it was very, very expensive to finance it. And so no one, actually all of the systems were purchased outright, either with home equity loans or, regular operating funds, from households. Right. And, we had, 450 assessments, and we had a large number of assessments, and most of those, obviously most of them didn't go through. We only had 23 installations, but many more of them would have gone through if there was some kind of reasonably useful and affordable financing available.
Yeah, and I think one thing it's a New York thing, Brooklyn, is that you have with the fire code and things like that, you ultimately have relatively small systems that are installed on roofs. They may be perfectly adequate for a person who lives there, but it makes it difficult for the economics of leasing. So it's usually bigger systems work better for that. So it's a bit of a problem. But Jeff, how are you guys sort of tackling the finance issue? Are you incorporating it directly kind of into your education? Are you working with another financing partner, or is it whoever the installer brings along with them?
So it'll be whoever the installer brings along with them, but I think we're fortunate to some extent that we're undertaking this process a couple of years after the original Solarize Brooklyn. The market has changed quite a bit. I think Green Tech Media projected last year that leases in terms of the overall residential solar market would peak as a percentage of financing tools in the residential market, and are now starting to be replaced increasingly with loans. And so we didn't want to limit what installers could offer, and so in our RFP it was pretty wide open. We did require at least one zero down financing option, but as to what that was and whether it was a lease or a loan, or it could be more than one, we left that open for installers to determine, because we felt like they had the best pulse on what their customers were asking for and what was serving the market best, and we didn't want to constrain that really. But I think the way that the market has moved in the last couple of years, there are increasingly these loan options that function very much like a lease in terms of being a zero down option for a customer, but they offer many of the benefits of owning the system, including a better return over the life of the system than on a lease. Now, that's not to endorse one over the other. I think there are certain cases where a lease may be more beneficial to certain types of customers who are looking for kind of a quick, no hassle, just really simple process. But having more options certainly doesn't hurt, and so we tried to encourage that as best we could through our RFP, leaving the options open but requiring at least one zero down option. Then I should also mention that NYSERDA had released the Green Jobs, Green New York financing options, which is it's basically a subsidized loan for solar systems several months before our RFP, and that included an option for on-bill financing, which is really great, especially for low to moderate income customers. And NYSERDA had announced actually just at the end of last year that program is going to be transitioning to a low to moderate income only program over the next couple of months, I think starting in April. But that's also on the table as well. We wrote that into our RFP that that was an option that installers could provide. And so we're hoping that between that and some of the other financing options that are now out there for financing in terms of loans, but also leases, will provide more of a suite of options, so to speak, for the customers that can help to overcome some of those challenges that Ellen talked about.
Right. Great. Well, thanks so much. I would like to wrap up here, and I'd like to end. I hope this works. I sent you the questions beforehand, but again, different phases here. Solarize Brooklyn is essentially over. There is a few things that need to be still finished with a couple of homeowners. Jewish Greening Fellowship, we're in the installation phase. Jeff, you're just about to kind of get going on the public sort of side of this thing. And I wonder if each of you could just sort of share one sort of major takeaway when you look back or look forward on this that sort of most sort of occupies your thoughts in terms of what makes it work, or what is a really big challenge that you sort of face with the program. Does that make sense? It does? Okay, great. I see, Mirele, you're shaking your head yes, so I'm going to assume you can answer that question. So Mirele, I'll leave you the pearl of wisdom.
I have so much wisdom I'd like to pass on to someone else, but I think the key would be, I think the key thing I would want to share is about communication and how important communication is, and the fact that people really don't know what they're getting into, even though we were working with, some pretty sophisticated people who run, big buildings and so on. But, this is sort of still the Wild West out there from what I can see. And things are really not as easy as the industry makes it sound. And that you have to be prepared for a lot of things that might happen. And Chris, you've been great at helping us to try to pin that down, creating that solar process guide that you did, which it was kind of amazing that no one had it before. But there's a lot of information that needs to be shared, and finding the way to do it in a way that doesn't scare people, but does prepare them for the fact that this is something that can take a lot longer than they think it's going to take, and they could run into a lot more obstacles than they think they could run into, is key.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, looking at a study of Solarize programs all over the country, is that the education part up front, to build that into it, not have it just be led sort of by sales process, but rather, what do we know about the sector? How do we let people know up front what they're getting into? Really makes things way easier down the line. That seems to be a unanimous consent of anybody who's done Solarize programs. And Ellen, you may agree with that as well.
I absolutely agree with that. And I want to add to that transparency, but on both sides, because we were a neighborhood organization. We accepted anyone who wanted to help us, and that really helped move the thing along, because we had no other agenda. And that came up a lot, especially at the education sessions, when people saw for-profit companies at the Y or the library or whatever. They're like, what are they doing there? We're like, they're the ones installing the solar. Don't think that I'm going onto your roof and installing your solar system, right? So the transparency of how the organization works and who's nonprofit, who's for-profit, and we're all mission-driven or whatever is also really critical, because the industry is just not at a place yet where, Mirele is absolutely right. It still seems like the Wild West to homeowners anyway.
Again, so it's that trust and the relationship that you have is sort of this mitigating factor, I guess, between these unknown solar people and potential people. Is there anything else you'd like to add to that in terms of a big thing that sort of sticks in your mind, for better or for worse?
No, I'm just so happy to see what some of, what happened after the Solarize program. Like we had a very sort of narrow focus about what we thought we could accomplish, and we did accomplish it, and we were thrilled that we did it. But to see what you're doing and what CUNY is doing is so great to have a legacy from our little program, and we're thrilled with the success of it, and and we hope to see many more.
Yeah, and I'll just add on that too, is that it's been great. There's a report that we wrote about the Solarize Brooklyn experience, which is actually we posted in the notes here. But when you described early on the organic way in which this happened, and it was an idea that took off, that is the way this thing works. And what I love about solar is that because it's distributed, because individuals can own it, it lends itself to that kind of an impulse or initiative that's not how power plants are built. Let's just leave it at that. So I think it's a great example of how that can happen with solar. So Jeff, when you look forward now, in terms of, is there any kind of maxim or mantra that you sort of say to yourself now that you're about to step into the public part of this process, that you think will be key to sort of making it work, or anything else you want to share?
Well, I mean, since we're in such an early stage of our program, I think I would emphasize the lessons learned that we've had so far, and really that's going back to transparency. I think being transparent with yourself as an organizing entity, and really getting the best thoughts and best practices from other Solarize groups is important, because it is a lot of work to put on a program like this, whether you're an entity that does it professionally or just a group of volunteers. There's a lot of hours that have to be put in, a lot of expertise generated to review proposals and to put together an RFP, and I think just being cognizant of that going in will help you in terms of making sure that you put together a program that is streamlined. I would just emphasize kind of simple is generally better, and especially when you're talking about trying to lower costs, that putting together an RFP that's easy to review and also easy for installers to fill out is going to save them time, and ultimately that's affecting everybody's bottom line. That's not to say that you don't want to make it comprehensive, but really focusing on streamlining of internal efforts as well as working externally on the streamlining efforts that we talked about earlier related to permitting and interconnection and all of that, the more of a streamlined process that a group can create internally for their Solarize effort is going to help and trickle down through the program to savings for the customers.
Right. Great. Well, thank you all so much. That was really good. Again, there's so much more that we could talk about any aspect of this. It really is a complicated thing with many moving parts. But Mirele and Ellen, you've done great work, and hopefully people have gotten some insight into what you've achieved. And Jeff, very excited to see what your group was able to do in that area. I think that being able to combine all the assets that Sustainable Community really has to this type of project, I think will lead to great results. So. Thank you guys so much. Really appreciate it, and have a good day. Bye.
Thanks, Chris. Bye.